Good evening. I want to welcome everybody who's joining in. This is the community workshop for the housing element for the city of Calabasas. I'm Tom Bartlett. I'm the city planner. We have a number of other staff here and our housing consultant. But before we get started on everything and I introduce who's who, I would like everybody to join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. And we'll have the flag displayed shortly. There we go. So if everybody would please place your hand over your heart and begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible,
and liberty
and
justice for all.
Okay, thank you. Okay, again, welcome. This is the community workshop for our update to the housing element. I want to welcome again everybody. Before we get started on the actual workshop itself, I would like to introduce the participants and cover a little bit of, I guess I'll call it housekeeping. So helping me this evening is Michael Klain, our senior planner. Also, our Director of Community Development, Maureen Tamori, is here. Judy Gilly, our Associate Planner, and also Jacqueline Rackerby, our Assistant Planner. We also have our Housing Consultant, Karen Warner. Karen will be leading the presentation and most of the discussion. Michael Klein will be playing a significant role, and myself, and those will be the primary three people, but we will have some supporting work by the others. We will have opportunities for the community, that's the whole point, to give us their input, and that will be accomplished through both some short surveys, which will be made more clear a little later, as well as question and answers toward the end. I do want to remind everybody that this meeting is being recorded so that it can be rebroadcast via CTV. So if anybody is unable to participate now, or if you know other people who would like to see this information, they can pull it up on CTV at a later time. So we're trying to get the information out to as broad of an audience as possible. So I think that covers the introductory items. We do have a website that's set up for the housing element. I want to remind everybody that information is available there, including our survey that has been available for approximately 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks now. And the survey period closes the end of September, which is today. But that means tonight and probably until tomorrow morning, until we actually get to the point of shutting it down. People can still take the survey. So if anybody has not yet taken the survey, please don't take it twice or 3 times. But if you haven't taken the survey, please go to our website and you'll find it there. And please take it. Okay, so let's go ahead and get our information going. I'd like to invite Karen Warner to kick it off. There we go.
Thank you, Tom. Next slide. So what we're going to cover today is a little background on the housing element, so everybody understands what this is. We'll discuss the city's progress under its current element. We wanted to provide you with some housing trends and needs. We're going to talk about the 4-letter RENA word and residential sites. And we're going to open it up to the community for discussion. And then we'll leave you with what the next steps are in the process.
And then if we could go back, I'm sorry. If we could go back, that is the website. You go to the city's website, you go to the government subpage and community development department. There is a page for the housing element update. That's where everyone will find the survey as well as a whole bunch of other information. Thank you.
Great. And we'd like to start with just a general polling question, so we kind of understand who's there. And it looks like we have about 20 attendees right now. So if we can launch the poll. So on your screen, you'll be able to click on a response. The first question is, how long have you lived in Calabasas? 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5 years, 6 to 10, 11 to 20, or 21 years or longer. And the second question is, what type of unit do you live in? A detached single-family home, a duplex, triplex, fourplex, a condominium, an accessory dwelling unit or secondary unit, a mobile home, a care facility or assisted living, or other. So go ahead and enter your responses to the questions.
I'm going to give it a few more minutes. It looks like we have 9 of 14 responses so far.
Okay.
Let's see, we're not getting any more.
Okay, why don't we go with what we have?
Okay, let's see. I'll go ahead and end this one.
So Karen, or attendees, everybody out there, if you weren't following along or quite understanding, these polls that are showing up are interactive. And so anybody who's logged in with a computer should be able to use your mouse and click on those optional responses and participate in the poll. Now, I do see that some of the participants are using their phones. They're not going to be able to do that. And so we apologize for that. But again, if the people who are participating using their phones have not taken the survey, please go on our website and you can take the survey, which has the same questions basically, as well as a number of other questions. But I do want to point out that anybody who's on with their computer should be able to take this poll. Thank you.
Jacqueline, you want to show us the results?
Yes, go ahead and share.
Okay, so we have 11% of the people have been here 3 to 5 years, 22% 11 to 20, and 67, 2/3, have been here more than 21 years. So that's fantastic. In terms of what type of unit, 78% of you live in a single family home and 22% in a condominium. Okay. So next slide. So just to make sure everyone is on the same page in terms of what the housing element is, it's part of the city's 2030 general plan, of which I'm sure some of you were involved in. It's, you know, very much based on community participation, like the general plan was. The survey that Tom has referenced, we've received over 900 responses so far, which is really phenomenal for a community of your size. And it really shows the level of community involvement here. So this is really our initial kickoff for public involvement in addition to the survey, and we hope you stay involved throughout the process. So the housing element, as part of the city's general plan, is a state mandate to adequately plan to meet existing and projected housing needs of all economic segments of the community. It's comprised of 4 major components: the review of accomplishments in the city's existing element, a housing needs assessment, an evaluation of any constraints to producing housing, the identification of sites, and an 8-year program strategy. So I think a lot of people, when they think of the housing element, they think it's really, we have to identify sites for this future housing growth, but it's actually much more than that. The housing strategy includes programs that address, all kinds of housing needs, related to housing maintenance and preserving existing housing. So it's really kind of the whole breadth of whatever housing issues are identified, or then identified, there's programs to address in the strategy. The housing element is required to be reviewed by the state, Hcd, Department of Housing and Community Development. So the draft element is sent up to the state, and they have 60 days to review it for compliance with housing element statutes. And they make a finding of whether the element is in compliance or out of compliance. Next slide. The city's existing element is in compliance, and there's significant benefits to having the state stamp of approval. If there were litigation on the city's housing element, there's a presumption of legal validity if HCD has approved the element. If the courts were to invalidate the element, they will suspend the city's authority to issue building permits until the element's brought into compliance. Hcd Compliance provides protection from attorney general litigation. This is a new authority that is under state housing law now, that the Attorney General can sue cities that don't have an HCD compliant element. And most recently, the AG sued the city of Huntington Beach until their element was brought into compliance. An HCD compliant element allows the city to maintain discretionary review over affordable housing. The city is eligible for a variety of state housing funds if it has an HCD compliant element. So for example, the city received $160,000 in state planning grant funds earlier this year, which it would not have been eligible for if it didn't have an in compliance element. And then lastly, the element does the RENA, which we'll talk about in further detail in a moment, doesn't carry over into the future housing element cycle. Whereas if your element was out of compliance, your RENA continues on from the last cycle. So it becomes more and more challenging to become in compliance. Next slide. What the housing element doesn't do is it does not require the city to build the units that are planned for. However, under SB, what's known as SB 35, if the element, if the city is not significantly progressing on its regional housing needs, projects may be eligible for streamlined approval. The housing element doesn't directly provide funding. And the housing element doesn't authorize construction on any of the housing element sites. So development projects still need to go through the city approval process. Next slide. So we've looked at the city's progress under the current element, which is 2014 to 2021. And during the first 6 years of the element, we just wanted to highlight some of the accomplishments that the city has achieved. The city has approved 3 mixed income projects, the Avante Calabasas, the Paxton Calabasas, and Calabasas Creekside. And there are 17 very low income units dispersed throughout those projects. The city's granted density bonus incentives on 2 projects, so making it more economically feasible to provide the affordable units. The city's provided rehabilitation assistance to 33 lower income homeowners, and these are primarily in the mobile home park. The city provides rental assistance to approximately 50 lower income households. And this rental assistance payment has increased from $190 to $240 a month during the period. And the city has an ongoing monitoring program to monitor the rents through the rental registration. Next slide after that. Okay. The city has issued a $50,000 loan to allow a low moderate income homeowner to convert a garage to an accessory dwelling unit. And the city has issued permits for 15 accessory dwelling units with actually another 7 currently in progress. The city updated its accessory dwelling unit ordinance to facilitate these types of housing. And then as a downside, during the planning period, the 140 deed restricted low-income units in Malibu Canyon and 120 restricted units at Avalon Bay converted to market rents due to payoff of their bonds. The city had discussions with both the LA County Community Development Commission and the California Housing Partnership about various options to try to maintain the affordability in these projects. And both of these entities said that without significant financial resources, the options to preserve the units were quite costly. Next slide. So we want to look at some of the demographic and housing trends to better understand the community's housing needs. So we looked at this over the last 20 years. So between 2000 and current, the city's population has grown by about 20%. And this is in comparison to a 7% growth countywide. So the city's grown much faster than the county average. In the most recent 10 years, this growth has really slowed. And then the projection for future growth is much slower, only 2.9%. During this 20-year period, the city's population has continued to grow older. The median age has increased from 38 to 43 years, which is much older than the county, which has a median age of 37. And the city's also seen a decrease in family households with children, which has decreased from 43% to 35% of all households have families with children. And this is partly reflected in the high housing costs where young families aren't able to afford to move here. The Las Virgenes School District also reports decreasing enrollment. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the city is aging, as most places are. And so one of the significant needs groups in Calabasas are your senior citizens. About 17% of your population is over 65. 40% of seniors are age 75 plus, which is kind of the age threshold when people start needing more assistance with their housing, be it housing maintenance or supportive living environments. The majority of your seniors are homeowners, and a quarter of those homeowners live alone. So the types of housing needs of Calabasas seniors are home accessibility improvements, perhaps maintenance assistance, accessory dwelling units or shared housing to prolong independent living, multi-generational housing, supportive living environments, and rental assistance. Next slide. Another group with significant housing needs in the community is the community's workforce. Calabasas is considered jobs rich. They have about 20,000 jobs and 9,200 housing units. So that's a jobs to housing ratio of 2.2. 30% of the city's employment is in lower income populations. So retail, service industries, hospitality, and construction. Several years back when the city was adopting its commercial impact fee, they did a detailed survey of employees and employers. And one of the things that found was 40% of the recent workers to Calabasas were low and moderate income, and half of these low and moderate income employees commuted over 30 miles. So, one of the things we want to look at in the housing element is opportunities for workforce housing to reduce commuting. Next slide. So what housing is affordable to the workforce and the modest income senior population? We did a rent survey of the city's largest rental complex, Malibu Canyon, Avalon, and Malibu Creek. And these are the average rents in those complexes. The city does have some newer complexes that are even, much higher than this, but we wanted to really look at kind of what the average is. And so when we look at that, and then we compare that to what low and moderate income households earn, all of these rent levels exceed moderate income affordability. So occupations that earn moderate income can't afford the median rent in Calabasas. In addition, the city's rental vacancy rate of 4% is below the ideal of 5% for mobility. So there's not a whole lot of vacancies. Then the census provides information on overpayment, which is defined as spending greater than 30% of your income on rent. And as you can see, 62% of the renters here spend more than 30%. But what's even more significant, at least in my opinion, is that 41% of your renters are spending more than half of their income on rent. And just to put that in perspective, countywide, that number is 29%. So a very large number of your renters are spending, over half their incomes on rent, which makes them housing insecure. Next slide. So in summary, who needs affordable housing in Calabasas? People who work in town and can't afford to live here, special needs households, and children of longtime Calabasas residents that may want to come back to the community that they grew up in and can't afford to live here. And now we have another polling question. Jacqueline, can you put that one up?
Yes, I'm gonna go ahead and share that one now. Okay.
So this question is, what do you see as Calabasas' most important housing needs? And you can check as many as you like here. Housing for the workforce, housing for seniors, housing for families with children, housing in close proximity to transit, housing for adult children of longtime Calabasas residents. So let us know what you think the most important housing needs are.
We have 7 responses so far. I'll just give it another minute.
So right now I'm seeing on my attendee box that we have 16 attendees, 2 of which are on phones. So hopefully we'll get 14 responses.
We're at 10 so far.
Now, none of you want me to call you out by name, right? I can see your name, so come on.
Right, we have 12. I can go ahead. Oh, we have 13.
That might be it. So let's wrap it up.
All right, go ahead and end the poll. And I'm going to share the results.
Okay, so the workforce scored the highest, 69%. And then there's a tie for second, housing for seniors and housing for families. That's 54%. And then housing for adult children, 31%. And then housing in proximity to transit, 23%. And these this question is also on the online survey, so we'll be looking at what the community at large thought as well. So next slide. Okay, shifting gears, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or as referred to the RHNA, is what triggers the update of the housing element. It is established by state law. The overall growth is determined by the state HCD. State HCD then divides that household growth across the regions in the state. And our region is the Southern California Association of Government, or the SCAG region. And then they divide that growth amongst the 192 cities and 6 counties in their region. Each city is required to then zone for their fair share of the region's housing needs that has been allocated to them. The growth is based on state population forecasts. It requires the RHNA. It requires a mix of housing for various economic segments. And the affordability to those various economic segments are linked to zoning and density. And the last point is a very important one. The RHNA allocation is a planning target. It's not a building quota. And as we mentioned in the beginning, the city is required basically to set the table for that amount of growth through its zoning, but it's not required to, lasso in developers to actually have the projects built.
Right. Now, real quick, Karen, do you remember what the RHNA number was for the entire SCAG region?
I'm going to get to that, Tom, but yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, the entire SCAG region has a 1.3 million RHNA allocation, which is 3 times larger than they've ever had. So when we do get to that slide, you'll be able to see how that's impacting, other nearby communities with a much higher allocation than in the past. Next slide. So this is just a summary that the RHNA represents the minimum number of housing units each community is required to provide through adequate sites and zoning. And it's one of the primary threshold criteria necessary to receive HCD support of the housing element. So remember when we talked about housing element compliance, the biggest stumble block to having HCD approve a housing element is most often tied to providing the sufficient sites to meet this RHNA allocation. So it's a high bar. Next slide. So this shows the city's RHNA progress under its current element. And you can see the current RHNA was for a total of 333 units, and it's divided into 4 income categories. The third column shows the building permits that have been issued for each of those income categories. So out of the 88 very low income RHNA allocation, the city's permitted 12 very low income units, and that's been through its inclusionary ordinance. There haven't been any units permitted at the low income level because, again, very low and low is not provided through market rate housing. I mean, these are definitely subsidized units. The city's had 8 moderate income units, and that's really through accessory dwelling units, which aren't deed restricted, but by their very nature and size, many of these are offered for no rent to family members or caregivers. And the city is tracking this, and they've had 8 that have fallen into the moderate income affordability level. And then for above moderate income, the city has overproduced 179 units permitted compared to a need for 131. Next slide. So this is what the city's RENA is for this upcoming cycle, and it is still draft. It's not set to be adopted until February, but we aren't expecting significant changes. So the city's RENA went from 330 to 353 units, and you can see how it's divided into the income categories. And while the increase for Calabasas isn't that significant, there's a greater shift towards the very low and low income units. That last column, default density, this is where the city's zoning to be able to credit a site in the housing element sites inventory towards very low and low, the city's zoning would need to provide a minimum 20 unit an acre density, and then those sites can be credited towards very low and low. And for moderate income, it's a minimum of 12 units an acre.
And I'd like to point out to anybody, everyone who's listening, the key words there are minimum. A lot of what we see in our zoning ordinance is a maximum allowable density when you look at our different zoning categories. And in this case, under the housing element laws, they require a minimum density to achieve these and to get the HE certification of your sites.
That is very correct. Next slide. So this compares what the RENA was in the 5th and 6th cycle. So what we're in currently is the 5th cycle, that is the 2014 to 2021. What we're updating is for the 6th cycle, which is 2021 to 2029. And you can see Calabasas growth was just 7%. And a lot of this has to do with the early on input that staff provided to SCAG when they were developing the RENA to really demonstrate the constraints the city has with regards to high fire severity zones and open space constraints. So the city, I think, was very successful in communicating that, and that's why its RENA didn't go up tremendously. When you compare some of your neighbors, Agora Hills RENA went up 176%, Hidden Hills 127%, Malibu's, well, Malibu's was only 2 to begin with, so anything was going to be a big jump. Westlake Village went up quite a bit. And as I mentioned, the overall SCAG region went up, over 3 times, 225%. And now we have another poll. So one of the challenges is in this housing element update is to identify sufficient sites to accommodate that 353 RENA figure, along with a sufficient buffer. Because as sites develop, even if they're developed at that minimum 20 unit an acre for very low and low income, unless units are actually deed restricted at that level, they're not going to be affordable at that level. So the city needs to maintain an adequate buffer so that as sites are developed through the planning period, it can always demonstrate that it has enough sites to meet its lower income RENA. So the poll question is, what sort of strategies should the city pursue to address its RENA? And again, you can click any that you feel are relevant. Increase allowable densities from 20, which is the current max, to 30 units an acre on a limited number of existing multifamily housing sites. Recycle and intensify existing uses along Calabasas Road, East Village, to create a mix of office, retail, and residential uses. Transition the office and business park uses in the Agora Road, West Village corridor to a mix of office, retail, and residential. Transition existing office business park uses in Las Virgenes Moreau area, which is the old City Hall, to a mix of office, retail, and multifamily. Can I scroll that down? Okay. And provide incentives to increase the production of accessory dwelling units. So let us know what you think about any of those.
Now, while people are answering the poll, so that we can help people understand maybe what the higher densities in the city, or the highest, one of the highest densities in the city, the Canyon Creek project that was constructed over in just next to Old Town about 8 years ago or so, that's something like 70 units an acre or more. So that's really dense, but that gives you an idea, or 76 units an acre. That's one of the more dense projects in the city. So 20 units an acre is a measure, right? 30 units an acre is a measure, but we do have a project in the city that is 76 units an acre, to give you an idea of something even higher than that.
And the idea being, if you have, higher density sites, you need fewer of them. Whereas if you are sticking with the 20 unit an acre, you would need to have more of them.
We have 10 responses so far. I'll just give it a little bit longer for anyone still reading the questions.
And my count now is we have 16 attendees at the moment, 2 of which are on phone.
We have 11 now, so just give a couple more seconds to make your last choices if you haven't already. We're still at 11 or 12 now, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
Okay. So our top winner with 83% is intensifying uses along Calabasas Road in East Village. And then 75% transition existing office uses in Las Virgenes Moreau. And then 67% is transition office uses in Agora Road, West Village. And then 25% incentives to produce accessory dwelling units. And then lastly is the idea of having higher densities beyond 20 units an acre at 17%. So thank you. And next slide, which is the mapping slide. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tom to talk about potential housing sites. Staff has looked at, virtually every site they can possibly imagine, and we're looking for community input on which is the best mix of sites, and suggestions for any other sites that maybe we haven't considered.
Right, so Michael Klein is going to help me navigate through this. And what I'd like to do before we start zooming in on any particular site and talking about these particular sites is to preface all of this with the understanding, we hope, that everybody's going to understand this is just a discussion at this point about possible future sites. At this very early stage, anything we're talking about now is completely non-committal. This is just a workshop. We're not making any decisions, of course, at this meeting. It's just staff and our consultant working with you, the citizens, to talk about where housing might go. And we're not really going to focus on what types of housing either. That's something that would be talked about with more attention, focused interaction and discussion about that, the issues that might go with densities and that sort of thing on a site-by-site basis relative to the adjoining land uses, infrastructure, and those sorts of things. So for right now, all we want to do is look as broadly as possible across the city and think about where additional housing might potentially be accommodated so that we can start with the largest possible collection of sites, and then we start winnowing it down to the more appropriate sites as we go through this process. We did start with our planning commission with basically this same map and got some of their input on some of this to start. We now want, of course, the communities as well, and then we'll be back at the planning commission sometime soon to start the fine tuning process. So that's my introduction. We are going to try to get some citizen input on some of these sites as we move through this. I think what we agreed is we're going to try to have some people, if you have noticed, if you've been participating in other meetings during this strange time in our world using Zoom, you perhaps have become familiar with the raise your hand capacity. And so what we'll end up doing is asking people to raise their hands if, as we're talking about a given site, you think that's a site that would be possible for new housing. Not possible for housing of a certain type. Again, we're not going to worry about that right now. But if you like it, and I ask for your to raise your hands, anybody who would like to raise your hands, then you can do that, and then we'll move on to the next site. So I think that's how we talked about it, right, Karen? I believe that's right. That's how we were going to try to do this.
Yes.
Okay. So Michael is going to navigate through this map. For anybody who might struggle with what's where, I think what we'll do is we'll start on the east side of the city. And so here's the east side. We've basically got the greater Mulwood community here. And this is Mulholland Highway right there. And here's Old Topanga Canyon Road. So we'll start off, we're going to try to go through this pretty quickly because there's something like 20 or 25 of these. So pardon my, I may take a little bit longer for the first couple so that we can get used to how this is going to work, but then we'll start going through it more quickly just so we can get a straw poll of whether anybody thinks something is particularly better than another and we have more hands raised, that sort of thing. So right here, we're showing a large area that is roughly 176 acres. This has a little bit of frontage on Mulholland, pretty much across from where the athletic fields are at the high school. But most of the site carries on up the hill all the way to the city boundaries and is basically to the west of the upper areas here of Greater Mulwood and the Tentera properties here. This is Adamsville Road over here, okay? So everybody can get oriented. This is hillside mountainous zoning currently, and there are 7 existing parcels or lots of record within this today. So this would be site number 1. So if anybody thinks this might have some possibility for additional housing in the future, again, we're not talking about density or what type of housing, single family, multifamily, we're not talking about that now. If you think that has possibility for housing, raise your hand.
And Tom, we should mention that people that are on their phone, they can raise their hand by typing in *9.
Right, that's right. So unlike our survey, and again, we apologize for the couple of people who have phones where you couldn't take the survey. On this, you can absolutely raise your hand, *9. Okay, so we'll get a number of hands raised, and I think either Jacqueline or Judy's going to be looking for those so that we get a count.
Yes, I see.
I'm seeing a few myself. So if you think this has some potential, again, not worrying about density, not worrying about housing type, something to be explored later, raise your hand and then we'll move on. Okay, we've got a few hands that are raised now and I think we'll move on. So Michael, let's go to the next site. So I am going to ask people to respond, okay? And if you don't, you might miss your chance. But all right, so now we've gone immediately west of that site to a property that's directly across the street from Calabasas High School. This is about 16.5 acres. partly graded from something in the past. It's right where the bend is at Mulholland, leading up to the intersection with Old Topanga. And so now we want to have anybody raised. This is also hillside mountainous zoning, by the way. I believe before city incorporation, it might have had a county multifamily zoning, but that doesn't matter now. It's hillside mountainous in our current zoning. So anybody who thinks that has potential anyway for some kind of housing, again, type and density, immaterial at this time, raise your hand.
And Tom, we have a comment asking if you can share the current infrastructure status and the possibility for the addition of infrastructure if some of these more hillside sites aren't currently served.
Okay, yeah, that's a great comment. There are some that we'll get to and mention where there's not sewer service. Everything has the potential for, so far, these two. There's sewer, water, all utilities available. So there will be at least one other site, maybe a couple that we'll get to in a little later, that will not have the ability to provide sewer. I certainly will point that out.
And I see 5 hands raised so far.
Okay, so let's move on to the next site. Again, none of this is committal. This is just looking at anything that's out there, and it may be based on vacant current condition, or it may be based on the fact that it's underutilized. Some cases you're going to see some. So far, these sites, this is the third. This is about 8 acres, 8.5. It fronts Mulholland Highway on the north of the highway, just across from the intersection with Old Topanga, across from Wild Walnut Park here. Headwaters Corner kind of wraps around right here. Just past that site to the northwest is Viewpoint School. So this property, which is under single ownership and is zoned rural residential, is undeveloped. It has access to all infrastructure, including sewer. Let's see if anybody raises a hand on this. Now keep in mind that any given, looking way down the line, right? If one of these sites gets to the point where it's in our housing element, it continues to be planned and zoned for residential of some kind, some density, any future project has to go through the approval process, including environmental impact review, the whole ball of wax. So all we're talking about is a notion at this stage. Okay.
Tom, there was another related question asking if the city already owns these sites.
No, city doesn't own the ones I've talked about. I don't believe we own any of the others as well. These are all private properties. Good question. Okay, let's go to the next site, please. Okay, this is a property that is under single ownership. It's across the street from the mobile home park. It is immediately north of the Calabasas Highlands and southwest of Viewpoint School. It's approximately 13 acres. Access to it is primarily from Mulholland Highway, although secondary access for fire emergency purposes likely would occur via Calabasas Highlands, which would be a mutual benefit since they don't have a secondary access themselves now. But it is presently zoned rural residential, same as the site we just looked at before. Any hands on this one? Infrastructure is available to this, by the way, as well.
1 hand so far. Two hands, 3.
I see 3. Okay. Okay. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay. Now, I mentioned a minute ago in response to that excellent question about infrastructure that I would point out when a property does not have services. This property here, which fronts Mulholland Highway at this location and actually straddles Dry Canyon Coal Creek here, is dual zoned rural residential here, and Hillside Mountainous back here. I'm not sure if anybody can see my cursor, but it's Hillside Mountainous there, yeah, and then rural residential between the two roadways, but it's under continual ownership, or it's under single ownership, and it is one legal lot, even though it straddles a roadway. It also does not have sewer because there is no sewer for basically that entire stretch of Dry Canyon Coal Creek south of Calabasas Park Estates. So to extend sewer there, which is also downhill, is not practical. Everything that is near there is on septic. And so we would expect anything that would go in there would have to be able to provide for on-site wastewater treatment systems. That would certainly limit density substantially. So even though this looks like a fairly large site, between topography, access limitations, and lack of sewer, you're not likely to get a lot of housing there. So any hands on that one?
See one hand.
Okay.
See two hands.
Okay. Are we getting other questions that need answering? Now, by the way, as people do ask questions, we're looking at that and we're considering what questions are coming up. There will be opportunity at the end for us to get to a lot of the questions. And if we aren't getting to your question right away, it may be because we're finding that that question will be better answered at the end of the presentation. But if we see something that seems relevant for what's being discussed now, we'll bring it up. So this property here, which is actually within the country club property, is being depicted as having potential because this is where like the golf driving range is, a portion of the parking lot. It's shown as a potentially underutilized property, not necessarily a vacant property. Fully utilized, I mean, fully accessible in terms of not just street access, but all utilities. So if anybody thinks this has the potential to contribute to housing, raise your hand. Okay, we're getting some responses on this one. Thank you.
Hands.
And by the way staff sort of identified it, I think, let's see, do we have an acreage on this?
105.
It's 105 acres, but I think that's the acreage for the entire property in the tax assessor records. The area that we've carved out there that's shaded yellow is really more like about 20 acres, 18, something like that. Okay.
7 hands.
Thank you very much. So keep moving on. We're going to go along Calabasas Road now. Or actually, yeah. So we're going to go towards Old Town and then work our way west along Calabasas Road, basically. So which side are we looking at right now? It looks like we're looking at Calabasas Road. Now this property right here is right next to Anza Hotel. And it's a site that every year basically has a pumpkin patch kind of thing. And then shortly after that, tree sales. It is zoned for mixed use that includes commercial and housing with a, I believe, a maximum floor area, or FAR, floor area ratio of about 1.0 right now. So it is, and it's also a site in our current housing element for housing. The city's park and ride lot is next door to it as well. Okay, we've got some hands on this one.
I have 6 hands.
Okay, thank you all. So I think we're going to go across the street. Now, that site is fully developed today. It has office uses today. It is zoned, I believe, commercial Old Town, but we know that the property owner at least has expressed interest in pursuing mixed use development and redeveloping the property. The office uses there have been in place for quite a long time and may be reaching a state of what we call functional obsolescence. For somebody to seriously rehabilitate their offices, they have to invest a lot of money. They often have to lose their tenants in their process, and they lose a lot of revenue, and it becomes more feasible to start over almost than to renovate. So if it's reaching that kind of situation, then we sometimes it's maybe a good time to consider something different. This would be a property that obviously has access to not just utilities, but also to shopping services as well as city services. City Hall and the senior center and library are a short walk away, as well as the post office. So this we identified as having the potential to be redeveloped for mixed use. So if anybody thinks that has potential to accommodate additional housing, please raise your hand.
Ten hands.
And we're getting responses on that one. Very good, thank you. Now we've got another property here. Now I noticed that that property there is the Rasnick site. Now that Rasnick site is already entitled. They've already gone through a process of general plan amendment, zone change, and have a project that has its entitlement. So it's in our current sites inventory now. It's one that logically would carry over with the same type of land use, mixed use, and primarily multifamily. It's a little under 2 acres, and it's adjoining the Muro Creek and the Tennis and Swim Center to the east and the Avanti property to the west, and office uses directly to the north and some condominiums to the northeast. So, but that is the Rasnick property. It's still today, if you were to drive past it today, has some office uses, but it did go through a process to get a multifamily, primarily with a small amount of commercial, entitled, and that is in the current sites inventory, basically, or would be because it got entitled. But we want to get community input on that, should that be carried over into the new housing element.
I see 4.
Got some hands raised on that one. Okay.
6 in total.
Thank you. Okay. Next site, please. So now we're looking at an office complex. This complex consists of, if I'm remembering correctly, 3 buildings that are to the south and kind of wrapping around behind the little shopping center where the post office is. And that complex, similar to, if you will, to the one that we talked about 2 sites ago, basically. You can see it just to the north there at the intersection of Calabasas Road and Park Granada. That property we talked about a little bit ago is having functionally obsolete, if you will, office uses. This likewise has the potential perhaps to be redeveloped for mixed use as opposed to trying to renovate those office uses. And if that's something that seems reasonable and feasible, then let us know by raising your hand, but that would be a redevelopment situation because it is a fully developed property. We have some hands raised there. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to the next site, please.
9 hands for that one.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. Michael's navigating through our GIS pretty well here. Thank you. All right, now what he's selecting there is the Commons of Calabasas. And there may be some people that scratch their heads and go, why are you selecting that? A lot of people may not realize that has been zoned for commercial mixed use for quite some time in our general plan. I mean, it's been identified for that in our general plan and zoned consistent with that general plan. So it already allows for residential to be part of that commercial in a mixed use setting if the owners of that property had wanted to do that. Now, they haven't done it yet, but of course, anybody familiar with Caruso knows that they have done mixed use in some of their other properties. They have incorporated housing, and that has the potential to be accomplished here as well. So if that's something somebody thinks would be a good idea as the commons would evolve and move into the next phase and continue to be renovated and improved, then let us know by raising your hand. But that is zoned for that use now. That's something that we should carry on and recognize as a potential housing site. We'd love to know if you think that's a good idea.
See 3 hands.
All right, 4 now, I see. Okay. Remember, I said I'm going to start moving faster because I don't want, I know people, they want to get to, if they haven't had supper yet, they're going to have that, or they're still waiting for dessert. I don't know what, but we don't want to take too long. All right, next site. Okay, so this is a property. There actually was a community development forum very recently in the last week or two on this property. This is the parking lot next to City Hall, between Hilton Garden Inn and City Hall. This is owned by the company that owns the office buildings across the street. It is a private property, has been. It was that way before, but they acquired it when they acquired the office buildings. It also is zoned commercial mixed use. It is one of the sites in our current housing element. And it seems reasonable that we would carry it forward, but again, we want to get everybody's opinion on all sites. And so we're including it in this list to see if everybody thinks, would agree, or they may not agree. But this is one that we've identified as having potential for housing. We'd like to know if you agree with that.
I see 8 hands.
Okay. Thank you. So now if we move on, we've got 3 different office buildings in sequence. I think they're separately owned, but these are another group of office buildings that were perhaps developed in the late 70s, something like that, and reaching a certain amount of functional obsolescence again with the advent of newer building codes, accessibility requirements, you name it. It becomes increasingly difficult for offices to keep up with that and satisfy tenants and be competitive in the marketplace. And eventually you want to redevelop. This is something that in our existing housing element and general plan, the 2030 general plan, we identified the potential for this to be redeveloped as part of the East Village. So again, it is a site that we've had before. We'd like to know if people think this is having potential for mixed use redevelopment. This would be fully redeveloped because there's no non-developed, there's no vacant land here. All infrastructure's available, but let us know by raising your hands if housing seems appropriate here. Again, it'd be mixed use type redevelopment.
See 8 hands.
Okay, thank you. So let's see, is that done with the east side? No, we've got some more, just a couple more, I think, on Calabasas Road. Right. So we've moved down to just past Miro Road on Calabasas Road. So now to orient people, we've got BMW and Audi and Miro Road Bridge across the freeways here. This is an undeveloped property that fronts Calabasas Road. Now this is zoned for commercial use today. It's zoned for commercial use. But if somebody thinks housing makes sense here in one form or another, again, we're not talking about what type of housing or the density per se, especially when we're talking about an undeveloped property. But if you think housing in some capacity, could be senior, could be multifamily, we don't know. Right now, we would worry about that later. But right now, if you think housing could be accommodated there somehow and that this is a good place to do it, let us know by raising your hand.
6 hands.
Okay, we've got some input on that one. Thank you. And then we're going to go to another property or two west of that. So that, by the way, for anybody who is trying to figure out how far down there, Michael, maybe you could, with your cursor, show where the Silverado facility is. That's Silverado. So now we're talking about, in this case, the property we're going to consider at this moment. There are two right here next to each other, but this is what most people refer to as the old driving range property. For a short time, there was a driving range operating on this property, but it's long since been vacated. And so for all intents and purposes, it's an undeveloped property. I believe it has a wireless telecommunication facility on it as the only active use today. So it has a wireless antenna somewhere on it, but other than that, it's undeveloped. Okay, we got some hands raised on that one. Again, it's zone commercial. It's a low limited, commercial limited zoning, like the site we were looking at before. Okay, thank you. So one more site just west of that, slightly smaller in size.
9 hands.
And it is immediately to the east of the Silverado facility. Also zone commercial limited. Undeveloped. Now, infrastructure is available for these. Sewer, electricity, water, all those things. The trickier issue for these 3 sites we just talked about are things like the scenic corridor, oak trees, the topography, and fire access, because this roadway that they front is a narrow road that ends. It doesn't have any through access on both sides and that sort of thing. So they are tricky properties to develop for any use, housing or commercial, just to let everybody know. Okay, so that I think it's just for the east side. Thank you for everybody's patience and participation. This is great. We got a number of chat things and Judy's monitoring that. Judy, do we have anything we need to answer now?
I've been collecting a list of questions that came up, and they have been patiently waiting. So I'm gonna, if you want, I can go through the list. I'm gonna go back through the chat and read their question, or you can go back through the chat and I will give you the time, however you like to do it.
Well, if you're seeing anything question-wise that relates to a specific site that we covered in that group we just covered, because we're now going to move to the west side, but I thought it might be a good time now. If anybody asks a question about one of those sites, maybe we can address that real quick.
Okay, I have a few that will fall into that. Stephanie Asher is asking, speaking of environment, wasn't one of those parcels of special interest because it has oak savanna habitat on it?
Well, a lot of these properties are going to have some significant environmental constraints, particularly regarding the biological constraints in terms of flora and fauna. That's why environmental review is going to be critical. If you think about, for example, the first site we looked at, which was like 170 acres and worked its way all the way up the hill near Adamsville Road, I mean, there are a lot of environmental habitat issues that are going to come up there. The 3 properties we just talked about include a component of a county identified significant ecological area, which by the way, that 170 some odd acre property does as well. So she's absolutely right. There are going to be significant environmental constraints that would come into play. Environmental constraints aren't prohibitive completely. They are constraining, but not prohibitive. And they have to be addressed through the CEQA process, through the California Environmental Quality Act. So I truly appreciate anybody who brings that up and reminds us that it has to happen. And as we do the housing element update, we do have an environmental impact report that has to be done as part of this project, and it will look at least programmatically at environmental issues. Plus, any given project for any site would be identified would still have to go through an environmental review as well on a project and site-specific basis. Okay, what other question, Judy?
From Jean L, are you considering exposure to fire risks?
Yes, again, that too would be evaluated through the CEQA process. Fire risk, we've considered, first of all, as was mentioned by Karen in her overall remarks, we worked very hard to try to drive our overall RENA down on that basis. And we succeeded so that we didn't have to try to put a lot of sites, a lot more sites and more housing in more areas than would be reasonable for an area that is so exposed as Calabasas. And so that's thankfully why we got a much lower number than our neighboring communities did in relative terms, a lot lower. So that's the first part. The other thing is, as we winnow down the sites, remember, we're just trying to look at anything that has potential, but as we winnow them down to what we really want to focus on, that's a good point to use as a basis for making the decisions. And so some sites might be better not to put housing on for that reason, and to concentrate, for example, on some of the sites that are more infill. They're already part of the urbanized area. They are a site squeezed between existing uses or right at the perimeter of those uses, and rather than up a canyon and further away and that type of thing. So another good point. Thank you.
And
Another question,
else,
Judy?
Something else I'd want to add is the city is also updating its safety element. There's new requirements in the safety element. Extremely high fire severity zones is one of the new requirements that will be looked at extensively along with evacuation routes. So that will be happening at the same time, and we can pull in that additional information when we're evaluating these sites.
Thank you. So, and again, that will also show up in the environmental impact report for the house, for this project. Great. Was there another question relating to the sites, Judy?
Just a general question of who pays for the infrastructure, city or developer, from Joe Chilco.
Developer.
And last one is, let me see. Could you please comment on who will pay for the cost of the zoning sites 220 dwelling units per acre if the site is selected by the city to meet RENA goals?
Well,
Who pays for the cost of zoning up?
okay, what we're doing now in terms of this housing element and ultimately the decisions to include them as sites as part of that housing element and to do the corresponding update to the land use element that would show the sites and the corresponding density. Zoning falls immediately after that. It's an act of the council. There's no additional cost. They already have to do the adoption of the general plan update, and they would do the zoning amendment as well. So the zoning and all that would happen. Now, development plan, site development stuff would all be borne, those costs would all be borne by the developer down the road, including project-specific environmental review. They bear the full cost of that as well. I hope that answered that question. Okay, let's get on to the sites then. So now we're on the west side.
Tom, I'm so sorry. I just need to clear up. Is anyone still having problems not being able to raise their hand? I got a comment from Carol, but I'm not sure if you fixed it. I guess if you haven't
From
fixed
Carol?
it, you
I
won't be
thought I
able
saw
to.
her hand raised on some other items, but maybe not.
She says she can't, at 7:09, she says she can't raise her hand. And then Jacqueline, would you please, after each site, would you announce the number of the properties?
Yes, and
Announce the what?
the number,
Announce the number.
Number of hands?
The number of
Oh.
hands.
yes, number of hands,
Okay.
and then I'm lowering all hands after each site. I think that might have gotten stuck for maybe a site or two, but it
Okay.
should be.
Or can we ask Carol to see if she can raise her hand right now?
Well,
Correct.
she just
Carol said all is
it-
fine. She's fine.
Okay, great.
Everyone's
Right, and
good.
then also, Tom, I don't know what was going on or what's going on with the map. I apologize that it's turning blue when I select the site. I tried to relaunch the map, but apparently that's not fixing it either. So we'll keep going. Hopefully the problem went away, but I apologize if the map's turning blue when I select it. Trying to not let that happen, but
Well, it didn't happen this
technology
time.
gets better.
Huh.
Let's see.
I think people have been following along okay.
So far, so good.
Okay, so great. And again, thanks to everyone for your patience. And I'm seeing lots of stuff showing up on chat. So Judy's busy tracking all that.
Yeah, so
So
if you
now,
guys can, it's great if you can just hold your questions. If you do give me a question, I'm going to ask you to please hold till the end of this section when we have a pause. But sometimes I don't always get all of them. So if you can just please hold your questions, and we will all have a chance to have questions and answers at the end.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're looking at the sort of the northwest part of the city. We've got Mont Calabasas over here. We have the Malibu Creek Apartments here. This is Las Virgenes Road, right? I'm sorry, that's right. I keep thinking people can see my cursor, but they can't. Michael will show Las Virgenes Road and Thousand Oaks Boulevard. Okay, so this property that's shown right now is right up against the city boundary, northeast of Malibu Canyon Apartments. And it's under single ownership. It would potentially have infrastructure that would have to be extended by the developer and on the developer's dime if they could do it. It is zoned hillside mountainous, so the lowest possible density that can be that we have under our existing zoning today. And but it is undeveloped. It has a lot of topography, and it would seem some accessibility issues or whatnot that would have to be addressed. But it is an undeveloped property, and so we identified it. And if anybody thinks that has potential for housing, now let's see if you want to raise your hand on this one. It's about 20 acres.
Yeah, I see two hands.
Okay. Okay, so let's move on then a little down the road to the intersection of Thousand Oaks Boulevard and Las Virgenes Road. Now, this is a recently completed project. It's got retail uses and office uses. The original plan or concept there had bigger office buildings than what actually got built. So as this property was moving through the process, they downsized it to smaller office buildings. But if you might think down the road, you might think, well, what if housing was added to that in a smaller scale, but same approach that we talked about for the Commons of Calabasas? It could be commercial and multifamily mixed use. So if anybody thinks that's a good idea, please raise your hand.
Five hands.
Okay, so now we move south only a tiny bit. And this is an existing shopping center of, I don't know, 8 to a dozen little tenant bays. It has a liquor store on one end. It has I think a laundromat and dry cleaners and a number of other uses, a little restaurant at one end. Parking primarily in the back and some street parking. And I think some people will be familiar with it. It is zoned presently as commercial mixed use. So it has been shown in our previous housing element as a potential site for redevelopment with mixed use. It is an much older shopping center than most others in the city. And so I believe that's why it got identified in the first place for potential redevelopment for the last housing element cycle. So if anybody thinks that has potential for new housing, please raise your hand.
Right, 3 hands.
Okay, so we'll move further south. And now this is a hillside mountainous zone property. It's approximately 18 acres. And Michael, if you're able to move the map slightly so they can see a little more of it, that'd be great. Okay, great, thank you. So you can now see where the intersection of Muro Road and Las Virgenes Road is. And right, and Parkmore, which is the next intersection. And then this property is just basically a little bit to the north of where the fire station is and another large undeveloped property that's hillside mountainous as well. So all this property is zoned hillside mountainous. It's approximately 18 acres. It has one house on it today. And some, I think they have a few horses that run around in there. So if anybody thinks this has the potential to accommodate more housing than the one unit there today, please raise your hand.
Okay, 5 hands.
Okay, thank you. So let's carry on down the road. So, or I guess, are you, okay. Well, if you wouldn't mind moving the map a little further, Michael, that'd be great. Obviously you can see the landfill there. It just now disappeared from view, but now we're looking at basically what we call the Saratogas. We've got Saratoga Hills and right. This is where his map turns blue. I don't know why that happens. That's strange. So you've got Grape Arbor Park. That's really strange. It says Grape Arbor County Park. What map are you using, Michael? That's a city park. So we're gonna have to talk to whoever produced that map and get that fixed. But this is north of that. This property is, somebody earlier asked about whether the city owns any of these sites. And we don't, but the county of Los Angeles owns this property. So this is a separate property. It's zoned for residential single family today. It's undeveloped. And it is, as I said, north of Grape Arbor Park and directly east of the Saratogas. It's approximately 2¼ acres in size. So if anybody thinks that has the potential to accommodate some housing, please raise your hand.
Okay, we have 2 hands.
Okay, let's carry on. So now we're looking at an approximate 6½ acre property that abuts the freeway. It is southwest of the Saratogas. It is presently partially utilized by the Rancho Pet Kennel. And that's been a long time use on that property. There was an owner who might still be the owner, I don't know, or they may have sold it to somebody else, but there was somebody who was looking at redeveloping that property, and they'd done a community development for them. The property is zoned for multifamily now, and it is in our current housing element as a future housing sites for our sites inventory. It has all the infrastructure available. So does anybody, if anybody thinks that has potential for future housing of some type, please raise your hand.
Okay, 6 hands.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now we're moving back toward Las Virgenes Road, but we're south of the freeway. This property actually has a zoning, an application that's still pending before the city. It is shown on our current housing element as a future housing site. It is, in terms of its total acreage, 77 roughly acres, but that triangular area that's depicted is approximately 16 acres. That is the area identified in our general plan for potential development. The remainder of the 77 acres is identified in the general plan for open space type uses. So the development footprint is supposed to be contained within the 16 acre footprint shown there. So if anybody thinks that has potential to accommodate future housing, it doesn't mean you're saying that the current application is what you like. It just means you like the idea of housing there. Please raise your hand.
Okay, 4 hands.
Okay. And now we just pretty much go across the street, but a little farther south. There's a little shopping center that has the Jack in the Box that is immediately north of that. And oh, the name's escaping me. The Colony is directly, the residential community known as Colony is directly to the east. This site that's identified, if you want to call it a site, is actually 3 residential lots. They're zoned residential single family. There are existing homes that are there that have, for the most part, I'll say, been in place since, say, the late 50s through 1970. I don't think they were each one developed at the same time, but right now this totals approximately 7 1/3 acre. And right now it has 3 single family homes on it. It has a shopping center to the north, as I mentioned. It has a commercial office and retail complex. It includes the Mexican restaurant La Paz to the south. And it has the Colony with, what is it, like 48 housing units, I think, to the east on about 8.5 acres, almost the same number of acres. And then to the west is office and R&D properties that you can see there. So there is some residential to the east, but it's on 3 sides got commercial. So the question is, does residential single family add a density of about, what is it, half a unit an acre, the best use, or should it maybe be identified as a site for additional housing? So if you think it is a potential for additional housing, please raise your hand. This is what we call potentially an underutilized site. It's developed, but maybe there's a way to put additional housing units on it. It doesn't mean you have to get rid of the existing units, but maybe there's a way to put additional housing.
5 hands.
Okay. Thank you. So now we'll keep moving on. I think we're carry on south, right? So now we're looking at a property that has a church on it. I can't remember the name of the church offhand, but, and I don't know if you're able to zoom in, Michael, but this is another one that would fall into the category potentially of being, quote, underutilized. The church actually occupies only roughly 1/2 of this property. The rest of the property is undeveloped. And by the way, roughly, I think, half of the square footage of the church is actually in temporary structures as well, just to point out. So it has the potential for redevelopment on a part of it, and certainly for housing development without even necessarily doing anything to the church. So so they could use the site together, if you will. So underutilized is the category. And if anybody thinks housing potentially could be accomplished there, there is residential both to the north, to the south, and west. The water district facility is to the east.
Tom, I have a question pertaining to this site from Lynn Tracy. The site
Okay.
is private property. Doesn't it require eminent domain to take it over?
That's a great question. What we're doing in terms of identifying sites for potential housing is looking at the idea of whether the zoning should be adjusted to accommodate housing as a use. Right now, in some cases, zoning might be only commercial or for a public facility. I believe, now what is the zoning on this one? This one actually is already zoned for multifamily.
She was
So if the
actually
church-
asking about the previous site.
Oh,
The church.
oh yeah, well, no, where the single family residences are. So if we go back to that, again, whereas the church that we just looked at already has a multifamily zoning, this is zoned residential single family. So the minimum lot size, I believe in residential single family is something like 8,000 square feet. It's not 2 acres or 1 acre. This could be re-subdivided by a private property owner, by each of these private property owners, or they could sell to one who would redevelop it, and they could re-subdivide it and put, I don't know, anywhere from a dozen to 20 homes on there and probably conform to the residential single family zoning. So it's not a matter of the city having to do anything but just have even the existing zoning remain, and you can still accommodate more housing. Eminent domain has nothing to do with any of this. Eminent domain is a power that cities and counties have under the law so that they might be able to acquire property that might be essential for the widening of a road or something of that nature. It's unheard of practically that eminent domain would ever be used for property redevelopment. That was something that under redevelopment law in some states, some redevelopment agencies had that authority. Redevelopment agencies don't even exist in California anymore. So eminent domain is not a factor in terms of housing planning in this state, and certainly not in Calabasas.
And the zoning just provides the property owner the opportunity to develop. It's, the property owner is not mandated to develop it.
It's just a matter of trying to say, is this something where we might be able to accommodate housing, as Karen said. Right, so we looked at the church earlier, and now we're gonna look at school district property.
The church was 6 hands, by the way.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah, that's right, somebody wanted to count. So now, and by the way, for both the church and the school district property, we're gonna talk about, there is a law that the state passed where institutions, churches and schools have the ability to do housing development on their property. Right, Karen?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I just wanted our audience to be aware that under the state law, these entities can do housing on their property. And the city's not able to prevent that in terms of that's something that's allowed use. That doesn't mean we have to take whatever they throw at us. We still get to take them through an appropriate process for review of whatever they might propose. But they do have authority under the state to propose and to accomplish housing on their own properties. So looking at that then, and the school district property, we're now looking at their administration office building site. I believe that's what that one is. And there's undeveloped property at the rear of that with residential uses to the north and, if you will, to the west across the creek. So the question is, should this be an underutilized site? And the city's could at least be considered as a possible underutilized site in our inventory to accommodate additional housing? And if you think so, please raise your hand. We've got a couple hands. Okay, now we'll move south, and we've got still with the school district. And this is the middle school. And the middle school could arguably, reconfigure some of its service area and accommodate some housing on that property. Again, utilizing what the state permits. And if that seems like something that the community might think is reasonable for adding additional housing in the city, please raise your hand. Okay, I'm not seeing any on that one. All right, so let's move on. All right, now this is a site that got a lot of community interest and attention fairly recently, almost a year ago now, and then through March. This is the Avalon Bay Apartments, and it has the potential to be identified as underutilized. And we know that because we had the owners present a voter initiative that included a proposal where they showed how they could fit additional buildings where the carports basically are on this property today, and to reconfigure their parking, et cetera, and to densify beyond what the current density is. So having seen that go through, even though the voters turned down that particular project, that doesn't mean that some other type of project that might do some other form of that or partial form of that or whatever, that does at least inform us that has potential to accommodate additional housing. So we've identified it as a possible site. Doesn't mean it's one that's going to survive this whole process. But if you think that has possibilities, please raise your hand. I'm seeing one so far. Okay, so we've got one hand on that one. Okay. Are we done, or is there another? Did we cover them all? Oh, we got one more. No, we did that one. Maybe Michael can chime in and tell us, because he's the one that can see the whole map right now.
Yeah, no, we're done. That covers all of the sites.
We've got a lot of chat things where I see a high number there. So we've been through the map. Why don't you go ahead and show the whole city right now, Michael, and see all these. Right, and I can remind everybody one more time that this was all a discussion, just trying to get everybody to just sort of scratch their heads and think about it. And by the way, we don't think by any means that we have the ability to have already identified anything and everything that has the potential. There could be some property that any one of you are familiar with for some reason that you've always wondered, why can't that be developed for housing? And if there is a property that you're familiar with and you think has the potential for housing, you can send us an email and inform us of it. That'd be great. And we'll look at it and we'll consider adding it to the list. This is what we'll then use to try to winnow something down to what are a reasonable set of sites for serious consideration as we move forward. Great. So what questions do we have now on any other sites? And then we're open up to the general comments and questions, right, Karen?
I'm wondering what you want to do since we're over our 90 minutes.
Are we? Oh, shoot, I wasn't looking at a clock. Okay. I'm surprised my wife didn't tell me.
Tom, I have two questions that came up on chat.
Well, let's tell them what the next steps are there, Karen, in terms of what, where we're going with this whole process. And then let's try to get to the more burning questions. Okay.
Sure. So I've mentioned the survey, which closes at midnight tonight, but as Tom mentioned, it probably won't be until sometime tomorrow. So please fill that
None of
out
us are going to wake up at midnight to do that.
if you haven't already. We have the community workshop that we're looking at your feedback on sites, and please continue to send us your feedback via the website. There's a comment bar there. We will be going back to Planning Commission on October 15th to report back in terms of what we've heard tonight through the survey and then through comments on the website, and to get the Planning Commission direction on the site strategy. And then we will be off preparing the draft housing element along with the safety element update and some other minor updates to other elements of the general plan. That then will be taken to the City Council in a study session. And we will, get their direction on the element before we send the draft then to State HCD for review. And then the last slide shows the overall time frame for all of that. Our deadline for adoption of the housing element is October 2021. So we have about a year process that we're embarking on.
So if we could go back to that timeline just quickly, just go back to the timeline real quick. Karen, if you'll point out where the RENA SCAG final adoption, I just want to point out that everything we've been talking about with RENA, just remind everybody, it's a draft right now. They are planning to finalize it, carve it in stone in February. We're not expecting that the city's RENA is going to change very much, but it could go up or down a few. I'm thinking probably up, but it wouldn't be by a whole lot of units. And that would be based on more than likely an adjustment somewhere else because they have to keep the total number for the whole region. But that's when it's actually final. So whatever we're doing in terms of a draft element is going to work with our quote draft RENA. And we may have to, add a unit here or there to meet the final RENA depending on where that goes, but it's not expected to change a lot. Thanks.
And then Judy, you said there were two questions?
I have two questions, both from Joe Chilco. The first one is, I know Craftsman's Corner is being considered for annexing by Calabasas. Have you omitted it as a development choice because it hasn't happened, but would you be considered if it is annexed?
Great question, Joe. Yeah, that's a pending annexation. If we can complete the annexation and LAFCO would actually approve it and formally add it to the city, complete even that step so that it's on in terms of tax roll stuff, that takes time in itself. They can actually do their legislative approval and it won't actually take effect for maybe a couple months even after that. So, but we have yet to get a tax exchange agreement done with the county and to even get things go into a hearing. So unfortunately, we probably wouldn't have it annexed in time for it to meet the housing element and to include any sites in it. And you cannot include sites in any territory that's outside the bona fide city limits. So even though it's a pending annexation, we unfortunately cannot include any territory in there until it is fully annexed in every shape and form. And that's unfortunately probably still 9 to 12 months out. So I don't think we're going to be able to make that.
But we could certainly add it in at the 11th hour if it does occur before October 2021.
True. So, if we're able, we do know, we've had a certain kind of log jam, the details of which aren't necessary now, but we did get an initial bump up from LAFCO. They have a pending matter going to their board in another month, or less than a month now, for an amendment to the city's what's called its sphere of influence. And for the first time since the city was incorporated, we're finally going to be able to get what they call sphere of influence, which is sort of if you will, a future boundary that is outside our current boundary and includes Craftsman's Corner. So that moves us a step in that direction in a very positive way. And we hope that with that, once they approve it, we're going to be able to make some inroads with the county and start this bill to get it moving. The annexation, that is. So great question.
I have another one from Joe. Why aren't the office buildings on Moreau closer to Las Virgenes Road included for redevelopment? They seem like a perfect spot for housing. If Calabasas rents are over the thresholds that most workers can afford, how will they become less expensive just because they're built? Developers come to Calabasas for the most bang for their buck. How will the city attract developers who will focus on affordable housing versus making a big profit?
Well, that sounds like, I don't know, 3 or 4 questions.
At least
I think, I'm not sure. I think we're going to have to put Joe on number of question limit here. Let's see, on the apartment building, I'm sorry, the office buildings along Moreau Road, I think that's a good point. We actually even got an inquiry some years ago from one of the owners who was considering maybe even converting one of those buildings into senior housing, but they found out it was going to cost too much for them to make that change. I think that's a good point. So maybe that's one that could be added to our sites. I know that all across the whole country, office uses are going to be shrinking probably in the post-COVID setting. And so there will be a glut of office space everywhere. And so redevelopment of older office buildings seems to be like a logical opportunity for new housing. So we should look at that. That's a good point. Some of his other questions we may have to get to later. I'd like to hear from some other people.
Tom, Maureen wants to chime in.
Well, she's the director, of course.
I just want to say that one of the really interesting things that's happening right now is how many calls that Tom and I have been receiving from realtors. Realtors are out there, they are watching this process, they are actively participating because they are looking for opportunities within this market to effectively market sites as part of this process for development. And you can be assured that if there's an underperforming office building, like there is with Rasnick, that those inquiries will come forward to us. So I think that those particular buildings are a little too modern and not quite reached their obsolescence yet. But I suspect we're going to see more realtors come by to market those projects for housing. So thanks for letting me comment.
I do want to hear from some other people, but quickly, because I was thinking about Mr. Choco's various questions. One had to do with how does the city encourage affordable housing? We do have an affordable housing trust fund. And one of the things that the city can do, and we'll be investigating these kind of things as part of the housing element, but we could and perhaps should make the money available to leverage additional funds in concert with somebody who would get access to a property that would be able to provide affordable housing. Now, we also have incentives in terms of density bonus and inclusionary housing requirements and those sorts of things that promote affordable housing development as well. So we do have a number of tools as we go through the housing element update process beyond just this first meeting. A lot of those will become a little more clear and we're going to have discussions about them. So stay tuned and hopefully we'll be able to answer more thoroughly that very good question. So now, next question.
From Lynn Tracy, it appears that Avalon paying off bond early and not get lower income numbers for RENA, that was out of our control effectively. Can't the state hold them accountable?
Well, that wasn't a state issue per se, although the state housing community development has been watching that whole process. They've been watching it though from a really more of as a watchdog, if you will, over the city and our obligation to implement a general plan that includes our housing element. Not so much the owners and with the fact they paid their construction bonds off early. That was something they got under the county before the city incorporated. And then they extended the term once. And then when the city had incorporated and then assumed the responsibility, not really over the bonds even, but just from a zoning standpoint, well, they just kept their use. They didn't do anything with their property to change it, but they had this financing. So we had a policy in our general plan to try to see if we could preserve those affordable units somehow. We had dialogue with them, the owners, and tried to see what we might be able to do, but we didn't have enough funding at our disposal as a city to be able to carry that forward. And then they had the ability to pay it off early. That wasn't the city's fault. One could argue it was the county's fault because when they extended the term, one could say, well, the county should have made sure they put a clause in the agreement that would have prevented an early prepayment. And they didn't. Unfortunately, all this is water over the dam at this point. We can't change it. So we just need to move on.
And unfortunately, those county bond funded projects are very difficult to preserve. So, we've seen a lot of these expire. It's unfortunate because those were two very large complexes in Calabasas that had deed restricted units.
I do want to jump in and mention too, Tom had talked about the city's inclusionary housing ordinance. And in addition to that, the state's density bonus law now requires anything that's required for any affordable units that are set aside for a density bonus are required to be deed restricted for a minimum of 55 years. So that was the state's attempt at trying to close this sort of loophole that had been created decades ago that we're all now feeling the hurt for. But moving forward, a deed restricted affordable unit will be deed restricted for a minimum of 55 years, and there will be no opportunity for them, a property owner, to pay off some sort of bond and get out of renting it out or maintaining it at a lower income rate.
Right, that's a good point. I mean, that's something that's evolved not just with density bonus, but in a lot of all sorts of affordable housing conditions and that sort of thing. The 55-year term is now standard, whereas before it had been a 30-year term, including, for example, some sort of early termination thing. And those things don't exist anymore. Great, thank you. Next question.
From Keisha Bower, I would like a more robust discussion or explanation of the minimum 20 dwelling units per acre requirement. If zone changes are approved, quote, for free, this would represent a transfer of wealth to private owners. How will Calabasas residents participate in this wealth transfer?
I'm going to start off talking about this. I don't know how many people in Calabasas realize that for $1 million property, we get $407 a year in taxes. $1 million property, $407 a year. So let's say we upzone that property to meet a housing requirement. There's social benefits to bringing in low income at that particular property. But now the property is worth $10 million. The city will only receive $4,007 instead of $407. So we'll receive $4,070. With that, we may need to take care of library, park fees, other social services for those individuals that come into that housing. So from a wealth transfer standpoint, what the city really needs is to be very cautious about losing our commercial sites. Unfortunately, I'm not aware, and we'll ask our expert, I'm not aware of any city that participates in the sale of a wealth transfer that is generated to a property. When we upzone, it's Karen, we'll ask you, you know this stuff.
Well, and I'm actually reading her question, and I'm wondering if she's referring to the increase in property value to
That's
the
the way I'm reading.
property
so.
owner, and that is what zoning does. You know, that is just, you know,
There's
part
a
of what-
follow-up to her question, so that if you zone up Avalon, wouldn't this be a runaround the public vote?
No, it wouldn't be. The public in the vote that occurred earlier this year really considered thumbs up or thumbs down a particular project. That's what that referendum was about. So that landowner said, this is our proposed project. These are the number of units we would have. These are the number of affordable units we would have, et cetera. And then the community voted on whether that was something that they felt was a good thing or not, yes or no, on a referendum. That did not foreclose or prohibit anything else that might be considered that would be different than that project. So if it seems reasonable, as this would carry forward, I'm talking about the whole housing element and future sites, that the Avalon Bay could appropriately accommodate X number of additional units. That's completely different than the referendum. That's just a general concept of how many additional units we think, and I say we, it would be all of us, we, the community, the planning commission, the council, all of us, think could be on there. And how they would do it would still have to go through a development approval process that has to go the whole gamut in terms of review under CEQA, site development and review, and making sure it's compatible with the community, that the infrastructure is going to work, all those sorts of things, and public hearings. So it's no end around. There wasn't an end around before, and there isn't now.
And if you recall, the discussion of the council in making their selection to actually take that to the voters was that the project bypassed the city process. So the question is open as to whether or not a planning commission and a future planning commission and council would consider another project provided it went through the city's process. So certainly that'll be something we bring to the attention and will be on the minds most likely of the planning commission as they consider all of these site components though. But it would not be a barrier for staff with regard to a recommendation, yes or no, on this site. That type of decision making is reserved for consideration by the planning commission and by the city council.
Yeah, I think what we want to remind everybody is, if you think about the regional housing needs and 353 units, the lion's share of which have to be or supposed to be able to accommodate more affordable income categories, very low, low, and moderate. Roughly 70%, I think, of our RENA is supposed to be in those categories. Those are going to be accommodated some places. And every time any site gets eliminated from consideration, then essentially by default, that means you're going to have to put those units on some other site. It's not a matter of eliminating all the sites. No, if you can eliminate some, that means the housing is going to go on some of the others. So anytime somebody says, well, we don't want the housing there, be careful about saying that, because that may mean you really just said you do want the housing someplace else. Okay.
So a follow up to Keisha's question as well. When a site is upzoned into these 20-unit and acre densities, then there is a mandatory obligation to produce affordable housing at that location at the cost of the developer, not at the cost of the city, but at the cost of the developer. So that's an important aspect of our code that looks at that social benefit to the zoning upgrade. So any more questions, Judy?
That's all I have.
All right.
All right, well, I'm sorry we went over time, but I'm going to take that as a good sign that there's a lot of interest, and I appreciate it. A lot of you hung on for the whole thing. Not quite everybody, but a lot of you did, and we thank you. And sorry we had to do it this way. It's a lot more fun when we would get to do it in person. But I think this worked out pretty well, and we're looking forward to the next time. We will be with the Planning Commission, I'm guessing, via Zoom, but we are going to carry forward. The timeline didn't change for us. So, and if anybody has suggestions how we could do this better, send those along too. Thank you very much. And everybody, I hope you have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.